Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just another moment. We're just giving an opportunity for everyone to join us. We are live here on Zoom, and we will also be live streaming on Facebook. And we thank you for joining us. So we'll get started in another minute or two. All righty. Good night, hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion that we're having with Dr. Renee Smith-Maddox and Dr. Karen Lincoln in honor of Black History Month. My name is Amanda Decker, and I am the Senior Development Officer for Constituent Relations and Advancement Operations. And I oversee alumni relations and professional development. We're so excited to have you join us tonight for this weekly series that we're hosting this month. Last week we did Professor Devon Brooks, and this week we're joined with Professor Karen Lincoln. I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Ron Rubalcaba, in admissions, just for a few moments to talk about what's new and exciting here at the School of Social Work.
Thank you, Amanda. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ron Rubalcaba. I am the Assistant Director of Admissions and Recruitment for the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I just wanted to take a few moments before you get into this wonderful presentation and talk a little bit about some of the programs that we do offer here at the School of Social Work. So for our undergraduate students, we do offer a social work and juvenile justice minor. Now, this minor is designed for those who really want to increase their knowledge of the juvenile justice system and the various service environments for diverse youth populations. Anybody who is in the behavioral and social sciences, any student interested in developing a broad knowledge of issues in the field of juvenile justice, this minor would be for you. It's a particular interest to students wishing to pursue graduate studies in social work, as well as law, sociology, psychology, public health, and education as well. There are 4 required courses for that minor: institutional inequality in American political and social policy, juvenile justice in America, adolescent gang intervention, and community experience in juvenile justice environments. Now, in addition to that, we do offer a progressive MSW program. This is designed specifically for USC undergraduate students, and it allows students to earn both their undergraduate and master's in social work in as few as 5 years. Undergraduate students who have completed or are currently completing the juvenile justice minor, you're highly encouraged to apply. And so applicants who have completed the minor will complete less than the 60 units that's normally required for the MSW program. As I mentioned, you can complete it in as few as 5 years. We also welcome applications from other USC undergraduate students who again will complete less than the required 60 units for the traditional MSW. So it's a great opportunity to save time and earn your degree in 5 years, both your undergraduate and master's degree in as few as 5 years. Now, we do offer the master's in social work in a number of formats to meet your needs. And so for those who have a bachelor's in social work, we do offer a 37 unit, 1-year advanced standing MSW program. That does start in the summer of 21. For those of you that are still interested in that, we are still accepting applications, but I would encourage you to reach out to me as soon as possible. I will provide you in the chat box my contact information. Now, for fall applicants, we do have our traditional 60-unit MSW program. We offer that in a 2-year option or a 3-year option. Courses are in fall and spring only, with summers off. and you will complete 1,000 hours at 2 community-based internships that USC will work with you on securing those. Now, in addition to the traditional MSW program, I'm really pleased to announce the Working Professionals MSW program. Over the years, we've had a number of recurring adults looking to get into the MSW program that really did not have the opportunity to quit that job. And so our Working Professional MSW program was designed for that student. It is a 7 consecutive semester program. It spans over 28 months. It's guaranteed evening courses with a consistent schedule on classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. It is a hybrid program. And what I mean by that is some of your courses will be on campus, some of your courses will be online, really allowing for you the greatest flexibility that a working professional needs. Now, you will still have 1,000 hours of internship that includes both a virtual training as well as a community-based internship. Now, in addition to our MSW programs, for those of you that want to venture out a little further than that, we do offer a number of dual degrees. We have a dual degree with the School of Law, the School of Business, Gerontology, Public Health, Public Planning, Public Administration, and Nonprofit Management. So if you're ready to learn more about the social work profession and how you can inspire or empower or advocate for your community, then reach out to us at apply.msw@usc.edu, or you can visit our website for more information. Again, that email address is apply.msw@usc.edu, and I will drop that into the chat box. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Renee Smith-Maddox, clinical professor here at the USC Suzanne Dworak School of Social Work, and tonight's moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, and welcome everyone. Welcome to our monthly 4-series conversation, and I am your host. But this session is made possible by the hard work of the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, Office of Admissions and Academic Affairs. And I thank everybody who has made this day and all the sessions possible. So thank you, Monica Ellis, Amanda Decker, and Ron, and the rest of the folks that I know are helping make things happen and make things run smoothly. And being your host, I get to anchor this particular session. And, you know, this month, as we all know, is marked as African American History Month. But from my perspective, African American history is our history. It's American history, and it's history that's happening all year long. And throughout our series, I get to have conversations with people that I know and people that I really want you to know. And what happens this month, you know, we get to see how every minute of the day, with perspectives of the people that we're going to hear from. And tonight you'll hear from a special colleague of mine, and I'll reveal who it is shortly. But from the perspectives that they represent, as well as their tenacity and their courage, you know, from where I sit, they're living examples of history in the making. They're examples of what servant leadership looks like. They're examples of public scholars. They're examples of advocates and change makers. And I want to just sort of put in a little bit of history right here. And to anchor tonight's conversation with the historical work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He was a change maker, and he created what we know today as Black History Month. But he also used independently published media to center the contributions of Black people throughout history in public discourse. He wanted everyone to really know, see, understand, and experience what Black history was all about. Diversifying education and media is just as important now as it was then. And I hope today's conversation encourages you to keep pursuing new sources to learn and unlearn what we have known to be history. This is a 1-hour conversation, And at the end of the presentation, you will have some time for Q&A. And just want to let you know, if you're having any technical difficulties, please let us know in the text box. The text box is closely monitored, not only for your questions, but also if you have any trouble hearing us or seeing this video recording. We're on Facebook Live, and I am so excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Karen Lincoln. Dr. Karen Lincoln is a public scholar and an aging advocate. You'll hear more about how those terms really defined her as she talks about her work. But I'd like to welcome Dr. Lincoln to this conversation, and let's get started. Dr. Lincoln,
Yes.
hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing so well. I was waiting for this moment, and I'm going to just again say it's a moment of history. So we're getting ready to curate some history in this moment as we unleash our thoughts and our experiences and our insights. But I'd like to get the conversation going just to hear your perspective of what Black History Month means to you.
So for me, it's an opportunity for people in this country to learn more about and acknowledge the tremendous contributions of African Americans. You know, it's a short month, so learning should continue throughout the year and the years. But this month does reserve some time. It creates a space for us to reflect. And for me, it's a time for me to reflect on, how much our people have given to this country, as well as, unequal returns on our investment in this country. And so as such, it's a time for me to both reflect sort of in this moment, in the present, how far we've come and how far we have to go.
Yes, time for reflection. Sometimes these days I'm saying reflection, reconciliation, and really a time to think in a forward way. What's our future?
Mhm.
As I listen to you, I'm wondering these days, especially these days, where are you getting your inspiration?
Well, it's interesting because I'm a social worker and a sociologist, right? So I have masters in both and PhDs in both, and so for me, the human condition is always my inspiration. I'm very much preoccupied with inequality and societal factors that determine, the circumstances and the lived experience of African Americans specifically, and of underserved and underrepresented people and communities more broadly. So I'm inspired by, what we're experiencing in this moment, what we have experienced historically, and the ways that we can disrupt the impact of some of these larger societal factors like racism and discrimination and oppression on the health in particular and well-being of African Americans.
That word disruption, I'm holding that one because the time for disruption has come. And I'm also connected to what John Lewis has always told us. We just need to keep getting into some good old trouble, good trouble. As I hear about your work and really sort of this connection to the human condition, and really sort of seeing, all of the different ways in which inequality manifests itself. Could you shed some light on the projects that you're working on?
Sure. So myself as one project, right? So I have a program called Advocates for African American Elders, and I continue to work on that. We provide health education to African Americans in the South Los Angeles area and surrounding communities. So right now we are organizing a teletown hall so we can talk a little bit more about COVID more generally, but about vaccine hesitancy and acceptance and resistance, and some of the concerns that many of our members of our community have about vaccines in general and about the COVID vaccine in particular. And so in the future, I'm hoping to work on a couple of projects. So just very recently, I submitted a grant to the National Institutes of Health to study the effects of poor sleep on cognitive impairment among African Americans, because African Americans have a higher risk of getting Alzheimer's and dementia than whites, 3 times as high. And poor sleep, we also have the poorest sleep in the country. And so we're just starting to see a link between poor sleep and cognitive impairment. And so we'll be looking at what's called the perivascular space. It's sort of the brain clearance system that sort of takes out all of the toxic stuff while we sleep to preserve our cognition. And if you don't sleep well, that clearance system doesn't work, right? So we're thinking that maybe that's why we have these high rates of dementia among African Americans. And next week, I'm submitting another NIH grant to look at the impact of social distancing on health disparities. So that's what's coming up.
All important work and very timely, given one, for someone who doesn't sleep a lot. True confession, I probably need to be in that study. And also, the impact of the pandemic on social isolation and just how we relate to each other. We just don't know. I want to make sure that the viewers can also tune in to your telehealth program if it's for public viewing. So please, share that information with us so we can post it, because it's the type of forum that it's not the status quo, and it's the kind of forum that I think people are looking for, but they don't know where it exists. And so I want to thank you for doing that kind of work, and to keep us, in touch with all of the developments, because I think that any way that we can hear about your work, I think there's a piece of your work that's advocacy oriented, it's informative, it helps us how to sort of understand, our health situations, understand how to sort of read information that's given to us. And so you're helping us sort of decipher, the realities of the health sector and all of the complexities of just information overload and what it's like to live in a pandemic, and the fear and concern that Black people and people of color have with regards to the vaccine is real. It's very real. So, so for the viewers, you could see the scholarship of Dr. Lincoln is so critical in understanding what someone like her does in terms of contributing to, our well-being and helping us understand the conditions in which we all live. I know that so many people and some of the people who are listening are wanting to sort of understand, because these questions have come to me, understand, how might we train social workers to work with the African American community, or African Americans in particular. I know you work with the aging population, but just your thoughts in general when we think about training social workers to go into our communities and work with our people.
Right. So I work with all ages. So of course, I in terms of my practice, I do focus on older adults, but of course they have children and grandchildren. So you do have to work across the life course. And because I do focus on African Americans, some of the outcomes, health outcomes in particular, and mental health outcomes as well, start to occur in midlife and earlier, right? So that you could look at the CDC reports, and in the 20s and in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we're sort of decades older, sort of biologically because of some of our health conditions. So I have to sort of work across the life course. But, I think in terms of training social workers in the School of Social Work, I think curriculum is really important. And I think, curriculum that includes the history of African Americans in the profession, both as advocates and clients, I think is really important to understand the relationships between the field and African Americans over time. And so I think, having a curriculum that reflects the contributions of all people in the field, including those that were left outside of the field of social work. And African Americans are among those groups that were sort of left outside of the field of social work for a very long time. And so, sort of understanding the history of that, the social injustice and, the desire and the fight to be included in this field and to serve our own communities, I think is really important. The strategies, the narrative, all of that is informative for how we go about and do work in communities, because those strategies worked, right? Those strategies included, wider communities. They're tested and they're tried and they're true. So I think it's important for both students and faculty to understand the impact and the history of our communities in the field. And I also, on that note, I think it's important for both students and faculty to interact with the community, to better understand how people and communities impact, what we teach and how we teach, because not everything that we teach is going to work in our communities. And sometimes the keys and the solutions come from those communities. So I think engaging in communities outside of just field placement, right? And understanding those communities, and it can go a long way in terms of informing how we teach as well as who teaches.
Mhm. And, when I'm listening to you, that engaging in African American communities and even multicultural communities is so rich with insights. In matter of fact, that their work, their lived experiences becomes foundational
Mhm.
to us learning how to make their conditions better.
Right.
Because then you're, from I take away this important to co-connect, co-create, co-understand. And the only way you could do that is to be with the people, is to actually connect with the people, to understand their assets, their assets. So powerful. So when I think of the assets that African American have, the strategies that they can offer, I'm still, connected with, okay, how can social workers further engage in social justice in their work?
Yeah, I think, well, we have to fight racism, discrimination, injustice, wherever and whenever we see it, right? So if you see something, say something, whether it's a perpetrator of injustice or a victim of it. My son who did a report, his teacher was talking about the pioneers, right? And he wasn't learning about African American pioneers. And I had to sit him down and say, well, African Americans were pioneers as well. And so he did a report. I mean, I had to dig for information because it's not readily accessible to learn about and read about, Black pioneers. And so he learned about the Exeters and even before the Exeters, the Black pioneers who came from the South and traveled west, both as free people and as slaves, right? To states like Nebraska and here in California. Many of them walked because they weren't allowed to ride in these covered wagons with whites, right? And so, and then you think about the Great Migration, where millions of African Americans left the South to come to the North, escaping many of the same types of oppression and Jim Crow and, injustices. And, sometimes just leaving was like the most aggressive, radical act of defiance and protest that any of them could have taken, right? These were individual people making these, migrations, but it became a movement, right? And it changed the culture of the entire United States. It changed the landscape and the history of the entire United States. And so sometimes one small act, right, just leaving, can create huge ripples in our culture. And I think that fighting these larger, huge words like racism and discrimination might seem like we have to do big things, right? But we don't. We don't have to do big things. They could be very, very small, and that can lead to this ripple effect that can be a movement, that can be a revolution.
And what I'm hearing is a practice, if you will,
Mhm.
that, part of engaging social justice is developing a practice.
Mhm.
Part of that practice is actually listening. Part of that practice is seeing. Part of that practice is, as you said, if you see something, say something, speaking out. And sometimes, like you said, you just got to stand up and move. And it's interesting, you get to define that in that moment of what that means. But it's like you do not have to tolerate it or accept it. And that's how change begins. Don't have to ask for permission, but it becomes part of your practice and this level of consciousness that one has to have in actually saying, this is just what I do. This is what I do. So, so much I know in the DEI work that I've been doing, whether it's at the university level or in the community level, there's so much on the social media airwaves around racial equity and advancing racial equity. The Biden and Harris administration even has their agenda. You're seeing that those two words everywhere. For your perspectives, how can social workers advance racial equity?
I am a huge fan of Michel Foucault. And, as a sociologist, we learned about these, theorists and philosophers, and he's one of my favorites by far. And I think one of the reasons why, well, there are many reasons why he's my favorite, but one of them is because he talked about the dominant discourse. He sort of coined that idea of the dominant discourse. And the idea is that, people who have the power define how we understand it, right? Our understanding of diversity, our understanding of equity. And I think that, if we really sort of think about what is diversity, what is equity, what does that look like, who defines it, who controls it, and where are we now, right? Are we seeing any changes? How fast should we see changes? Are we sort of remaining in the status quo? We really do, as social workers, have to challenge those who are in power, who are defining not just diversity, but how we go about achieving it, right? And how we go about measuring it. We have to challenge those ideas. And I think people who are in power, who are maybe even unknowingly defining what diversity looks like, defining what equity looks like, defining the tools that we should use to dismantle these systems, people need to make room, right? They need to make room for those who are on the receiving end of the impact of some of these sort of larger social factors and listen to us. We need a seat at the table. And I think as social workers, we have to demand that. We have to demand that people make room for us and for our ideas. And, as social workers, including myself, people who are different from me, I have to sort of recognize the value in their voice, and recognize the importance of their voice and what I can learn. And sometimes it might mean moving over a little bit, giving people a little room. And that goes for students as well. I think we need to make room for voices, for different voices, and allow people to have a seat at the table to do something different, right? To think about the diversity and equity in a different way. And how do we achieve that? And I think that's the idea for me, is to really allow for new, fresh perspectives, so that we can create something different that is more inclusive. Because of course, the only way to understand inclusivity is how people feel about it, right? I can't tell you you're included. You have to tell me you feel that way, right? So really, I think social work is the only profession that is a truly helping profession that takes into account political factors, economic factors, social factors, organizational, community, family, individual, right? We are sort of the ecosystem of the disciplines, and we should be trained to be able to operate and navigate all of those systems, understanding though that you have these larger forces that sort of determine all the others. And so even if you're focused on clinical practice, you have to understand how these larger societal factors are impacting your client, how they're impacting how you interact with your client, how they're impacting the theories and the practice models that you use with your client, right? You have to take a more critical investigation and interrogation of the tools that we're using to teach our students and to work with our clients.
And again, as I'm listening to you, I'm seeing, the extensive dimensions of one's practice,
Mhm.
right? Sometimes people are saying toolkits and things like that, but it's a mindset. It's a mindset. It's how you value your contribution, but also how you see value in others. And again, it's back to having that voice, and some may say demanding that you get a seat at the table. Others might say, um, develop your own table, design your own table. But the point is that there needs to be space, and as you said, create space for people. And when we say diversity, we have to have this shared understanding of what are we talking about in the first place.
Right, exactly.
Are we on the same page in
Mhm.
terms of just
Mhm.
our understanding of terms?
Right,
Then we could get to strategizing. But
right,
before we could strategize, are we understanding the problem in the same way?
right.
Do we see it in the same way?
Mhm.
And are we here to help, support, uplift, affirm the people that we're all interested in, or we're all seeing that differently? But that common sort of, I would say, connection is all part of what I'm hearing you say. You have to find some common ground, but you have to show up. You got to show up. You got to have something to say. You got to have a perspective. And you've been teaching us so much in this moment. I did tell you all this is going to be a moment of curating history, and you're hearing it in every sentence and every paragraph that Dr. Lincoln has spoken thus far. I like to these days get to a point, I have to admit I have a sense of urgency in wanting to see things move, get done. We've been stuck in places. We can analyze the problem and saying they're wicked, they've been with us since the dawn of time. Okay, what are we going to do? So, from your perspective, what's the call for action for the field of social work?
Oh, what's the call for action? Well, I think that we have somewhat of a blueprint already, right? Because we have the grand challenges. And I think that the authors of those challenges put so much thought and energy into defining these large problems and offering recommendations and strategies for us to address them. The most recent grand challenge that I'm so happy to be a part of is eliminating racism, right? And so I think, one of the calls to action, and it sort of goes back to what we talked about earlier, I really want the field to revisit our history as a field, as a profession, because we weren't always a profession. We had to fight to be a profession. And I'm not a historian, but there's so much insight and so much to be learned in what we've already been through. For those who were excluded and that they're now excluded, all the strategies and all of the communities and others who supported that are very important lessons for us. And so, and the problems haven't changed, right? So, and I think the call to action will probably be the same, next year as it was last year. But I do think we need to understand that there are very interesting juxtapositions in our field historically. Racism, classism, exclusion, people fighting for social justice. And I think the social justice is so key. What does that mean? And it's really, that is the call of all of the framing values of this profession. I think social justice is the leading challenge. That is the call. And in that idea of social justice, there's a lot of change, giving up of power, creating space, sharing power, listening to other voices, making room, right? So that one call can create ripples of change, right? That will reverberate across our field and throughout our communities. And so I think that is the call, has been the call, and will be the call for our field, and that's social justice.
We've been consistent. We've been consistent. But I want to thank you for connecting us to Michelle Foucault's work, because it connects us back to how do we contribute to the dominant discourse. And really to keep that critical lens in terms of who's defining and writing the new narrative around social justice. How are we engaging in social justice? Are we thinking about some people and not other people? So it's good to see that we're still rooted as a profession in social justice. It has not changed. And I thank you for that reminder, for echoing that message for our viewers to hear, because it's consistent and there's room for everybody to come in, and we are welcoming people into the profession, because if there was ever a time that social workers are needed, and they're essential in so many ways. I want to give you a moment to think about folks who are considering the MSW or even the BSW, but what's your message to them?
I echo what you said in terms of now more than ever, is a time that we should focus on social justice. And I think, this is probably one of those times where, because of what's happening, with social injustice in the pandemic, and sort of these warmed over disparities that we see every single time we have a major event, right? This is the time to be in this field, because I think if there's going to be, a healing in this nation, I believe that social work will be leading that charge.
Mhm.
And you want to make sure that you are part of that. And, for our school and other schools of social work, the way that we train our students, we train them to be advocates. We train them to work across all of these multiple sectors, to be policy advocates and to be clinicians and everything in between. You can't get that anywhere else. And so if you are interested in being part of this change and being part of this movement, then this would be the field that you would want to consider. It will challenge you, it will inspire you, and it will change you as you change others. And so I encourage anyone who's interested, whether it's a BSW or an MSW, to take responsibility for your learning, and take responsibility for the change that will have to happen in this country, and to be a part of it.
As I listen to you, I said, when you hear social worker or when you see those words, it will say change maker.
Mm.
That's who we are. Um, all day, all night, every week, every month, we are on point. This is our space, and that's who we are. This has been a wonderful, enlightening conversation. I know I'm leaving with a couple of history lessons as well, but I want to give us a moment to just see if there's any questions that folks have for Dr. Lincoln.
Yeah, so we did get a couple of questions in from the audience. Tawanda asks, I would like to have a thorough understanding of the critical race theory. What are your thoughts about this theory, especially as we celebrate Black History Month?
Critical race theory is something that I've read about, and I think that it's I have the advantage of being a sociologist and being exposed to critical race theory, and so I teach from a critical social work perspective, which is very popular in Canada, which is very interesting. And so critical race theory it's similar in that it does sort of focus on race specifically, but I think critical social work also focuses on race, injustice, oppression, discrimination, and so that's sort of the perspective that I teach from. But and when I think about race, it's sort of all encompassing, right? It's just such a huge imposing factor that encompasses so many things. And so, for Black History Month and how that's connected to critical race theory, I think the fact that, we acknowledge the contributions of African Americans and carved out space in the calendar year has allowed us to even have critical race theory, for us to have an opportunity as scholars to sort of talk about race as a social construct and how it impacts various aspects of our life. And so I'm a proponent. I definitely teach from that perspective, and I think it's something that students, if they're not interested in it, they might want to think about being interested in it and learn as much as you can, because I think it's an important perspective that can be applied to the work that you do in this field.
And I am, on the same page with Dr. Lincoln. And you can look at critical race theory as a framework that helps you examine society and culture. So even as an individual, take away, being in an intellectual space, just as a human being, wanting to know, how do I really come to understand our society and the cultures that exist inside of them? But what is so powerful about critical race theory, it helps us really think about society and culture as it relates to race, law, and power in the United States in particular. And so it helps give you this analytical lens that you could see how much power laws have had over people, and how those same laws on one hand have been designed to protect some but discriminate against others. So it's very powerful work and a very powerful framework for social workers to use, given all of the spaces that they find themselves in doing macro, meso, and micro work. Yes, it's something that can definitely guide your practice.
And I'd like to add something. Thank you for the question. I'd like to add, critical thinking. We say that, but we don't really operationalize that. And I always tell my students, I'm not necessarily teaching you how to do research. I'm not necessarily teaching you how to practice. That's not my desire. I want to teach you how to think. How to think, how to critically analyze, the models that you use. Your framework, your perspective. We spend so much time researching a car, we kick the tires, we take it for a test drive. But when it comes to implementing these evidence-based practices on communities, we don't examine them. We don't critically analyze the tools that we're given to implement, on communities. So I think above all, critical thinking is really important to really understand the foundation of the models and the theories that we use and apply to communities.
Thank you, Dr. Lincoln, and thank you, Tawanda. Amanda.
Yeah, so Mary asked, Dr. Lincoln, can you give an example of how giving room for diverse understandings of diversity and equity leads to solutions?
So, that's a good question. So I think one way that we can do that is to, what Dr. Smith-Maddox mentioned is we have to have an understanding of what diversity is. I believe that I understand it differently than other people. So for example, we understand diversity oftentimes by the way we measure it. And we measure diversity by the numbers of people, right? And we can conclude that we have increased diversity if certain numbers go up, right, of people, or diversity has declined as certain numbers go down. And I challenge that idea because you can't count diversity by the numbers of bodies. You have to think about diversity in a very different way. And I think because diversity has been defined by the number of brown bodies and Black bodies and Asian bodies and and Native American bodies, like in a university, we're missing the idea of diverse voices. We're missing that there's heterogeneity, that we all don't think the same way. And so I think once we can agree that we need to redefine and re-understand, sort of what diversity is and have a shared understanding of that, then as Dr. Smith-Maddox mentioned, we can then move forward. And so I think that, making room means including your voice and my voice. How do you define diversity? How do I define diversity, right? Is it different? And I don't think we're at that place yet, because since in my many years in this field and at different institutions, I don't think I've ever been asked, what is diversity? How do you define it? And maybe we should just start with that question so that we can operate with a shared understanding or agree that we think about it differently and that all of those different ways of thinking about it should be represented in the conversations, and then efforts to achieve it should move forward accordingly.
Amanda, do we have any more?
Yes, we had one more question from Robert. As someone who mentors young people, I'm always looking for ways to direct students to identify careers that have long-term earning potential that will not be impacted by technology, i.e. artificial intelligence and technology. How will emerging technologies impact careers in this field?
Well, I'm not, now interestingly enough, we now have new journals in that focus on technology and aging. I did an intervention called BrainWorks that focused, it was a low tech intervention. And so I think that the impact of technology is very interesting. And of course, I'm a health disparities researcher. And so I think in many ways, technology has enabled us to reach more people, to have this conversation with people in different time zones and in different spaces, to teach. I mean, I have students who are in Korea, right, and the East Coast, so I think in many ways the work that we do, and even new HIPAA laws around telemedicine that we didn't have before, it's really impacted our field in many ways that has allowed us to do our work differently, to reach more people, and to advance the work that we do and do it efficiently in many ways. But then you have people who don't have access, right? And so at the end of the day, depending on the type of technology that we're talking about, we also need to, as social workers, recognize and acknowledge that we're leaving people behind, because we have people who don't have access to technology for a variety of reasons. And, so what do we do, right? So what is our role as social workers to identify solutions to address the lack of access to technology? And so I think, because I think of the world in a certain way, I think of these advances as both having positives and negatives, but they will always need solutions, because we will always have, people who are better positioned to take advantage of some of these technological advances, and those who are not. And because I'm a social worker, I'm primarily focused on those who do not have those opportunities.
Without a doubt, emerging technologies are creating new opportunities for us, and it's forcing us, if you will, to think differently, and to also consider multidisciplinary kinds of connections where we can advance our interventions in ways that we didn't think about when we start to infuse technology. And of course, technology comes in all shapes and forms. But the key is the critical understanding of the digital divide is so important to our work, and make sure that, once again, when new strategies, new initiatives, new intervention models come into play, who benefits and who loses? I see a comment. Amanda, can I read this comment for
Absolutely.
Lincoln? I'd like to read this comment from Mary Houston, and it's directed to you, Dr. Lincoln. She said, "Dr. Lincoln, you make me so proud of being an alum, 1984 PhD. I was worried about how social justice, racism, and African Americans were front and center at USC. Keep up the good works. You're following in the footsteps of the amazing Dr. Barbara Solomon, my professor and dissertation committee chair." Just
well,
make
thank you,
sure
Dr. Houston. I appreciate that. And I thank you so much. And I'm glad you're here. Thank you for
yes,
joining.
thank you. Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you, but just in closing out this segment, Dr. Lincoln, thank you for spending the time with me. I always enjoy any moment I can get to talk with you. So this was just as much an exciting moment and informative time for me as I hope it was for our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Thank you to you both, Dr. Smith-Maddox, Dr. Lincoln, for joining us in our second conversation with Dr. Smith-Maddox. In the chat box, I put a couple of links for everyone. So the first is to our alumni and student networking platform, Dworak-Peck Connect. There's a link to sign up if you don't already have an account. I call it the LinkedIn for our social workers and nurses. So be sure to check that out. I've also put in 2 sign-up links for our next events. So on February 17th, we will be hosting a roundtable discussion on social work and sports. We have a voice uncensored. And then we will continue this series with Dr. Smith-Maddox next Thursday with the Honorable Karen Bass, Congress member from the 37th Congressional District. She is a 2015 MSW alum, and we are so excited to have her back and have this important conversation with her. So be sure to sign up for our next two events. And thank you so much again for joining us this evening. Everybody, have a wonderful night. And as always, fight on.
Thank you.